I still remember the sound of that knock, sharp, official, final. It was a Tuesday morning, late spring, sunlight spilling across the marble floor of our foyer. I had just poured my second coffee when Mary called from upstairs, asking who it was. Two men in dark suits stood at my door, badges catching the light. "Mr. Whitman," one of them said. My name sounded strange coming from his mouth. When they told me they were from the Columbus Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit, I laughed. It was a nervous, disbelieving laugh, the kind that escapes before reason catches up. They handed me a warrant and said I was being charged with embezzling $200,000 from Midland Components. My first thought wasn't fear. It was confusion. I thought Doug must have made a mistake, or that someone had hacked our accounts. Mary came down the stairs halfway through the reading of my rights. She froze, holding her robe at the collar. Emily and Alan peeked from the hallway, still in their pajamas, silent as ghosts. I kept saying, "There's been a misunderstanding, officers. I'm the one who caught the missing funds." But they didn't listen. They handcuffed me in front of my children. The steel was cold, heavy, humiliating. As they led me outside, the neighbors watched from behind curtains. I heard the click of a phone camera. My Mercedes sat in the driveway, gleaming, a cruel reminder of the life I thought I'd earned. Inside the squad car, I kept waiting for someone to say it was all a mistake. But the silence between the officers told me this was something else. Something orchestrated. When I saw Doug Reiner waiting by the entrance of the police station, his face tight with fake concern, I realized just how deep this betrayal ran. His eyes met mine for only a second, long enough to know he wasn't there to help. And that was the first time I felt the ground shift beneath my life. They kept me in a small interrogation room with flickering lights and a metal table that smelled of bleach. Detective Carl Henderson tossed a folder onto the surface and leaned back in his chair like a man settling into a show. "You've had a good run, George," he said. "A big house, 2 cars, private schools, and now you get greedy." I told him I'd never stolen a dime from anyone, least of all Midland. I'd been the one to question Doug about the unexplained transfers weeks before. Henderson smirked. "Funny, he says you were the one skimming company accounts for months." They showed me spreadsheets, forged numbers, fake signatures, an entire paper trail that painted me as a thief. The more I denied it, the guiltier I seemed. When they brought in Doug later that afternoon, his performance was perfect. His tone was wounded, disappointed. "I trusted you, George," he said, looking down like a heartbroken father. "We'll let the courts decide." I wanted to shout, to tear the lies apart right there. But every word I spoke dug the hole deeper. By evening I was booked, fingerprinted and locked in a holding cell that reeked of sweat and despair. I stared at the cracked paint on the wall and tried to piece together how everything had unraveled in a single day. Mary called once, her voice trembling, asking if it was true. I swore it wasn't. She said the police had searched our home, taken my computer, my files, even our tax records. "George, the news is outside," she whispered. "They're calling you the CFO thief." That night I couldn't sleep. The sound of the lock turning outside my cell door echoed like a verdict. I kept thinking about Doug's eyes at the station. Calm, deliberate, rehearsed. And for the first time I realized I wasn't just accused. I was being framed. By morning my face was on every local channel. The reporters used my LinkedIn photo, smiling in a tailored suit, hand on the shoulder of a coworker. The headline read, "CFO arrested for $200,000 embezzlement scheme." I became a symbol of greed overnight. They called me the man who stole from his own company. Mary refused to let the kids go to school. She closed the blinds, turned off her phone, and told her sister Martha not to come over. Still, the neighbors stared. I heard from my lawyer. A man named Martin Kessler appointed because all my accounts were frozen. He spoke in half sentences, apologetic but resigned. "They've got solid documentation," he said. "It's going to be hard." Doug went on television that same afternoon, talking about a betrayal of trust and the need for accountability. Watching him, I could almost admire his performance. He'd built his empire on lies, and now he was using me as the final layer of cement. When I was escorted into the courtroom for my bail hearing, the flash of cameras was blinding. Reporters shouted my name like it belonged to someone else. The judge denied bail, citing financial flight risk. The phrase hit me like a punch. I wasn't a man anymore. I was a headline, a statistic. That night, in the darkness of my cell, I whispered to myself that I would prove it. I didn't know how, but I knew I couldn't die with the world believing I was a thief. Outside, rain hammered the windows of the county jail. Inside, the air smelled of mildew and metal. I thought of my family's empty house, of Emily's camera sitting unused, of Mary's trembling voice. Somewhere in that storm, a truth began to burn in me. If the world wanted a criminal, they were about to find out what kind of man they had framed. Before everything collapsed, my life ran like a well-oiled machine, predictable, polished, and proud. Every morning I'd drive down Lakeshore Drive in my silver Mercedes, the smell of Mary's coffee still on my hands, the radio humming low jazz. The house behind me was everything I'd dreamed of: white pillars, a trimmed lawn, and a view of the lake that caught the sunrise like fire. I thought I'd earned it all through discipline, through late nights at the office, through saying yes to responsibility when everyone else said not it. At Midland Components, I wasn't just the chief financial officer, I was Doug Reiner's right hand. He used to call me the numbers whisperer. I balanced books, managed audits, and handled investor confidence. People trusted me. When I walked through the glass doors each morning, junior accountants straightened their ties. Even Ethan Coleatter, fresh out of college, always eager, used to say, "Mr. Whitman, I hope I'm like you in 20 years. Mary loved to tell her friends that I'd made it from nothing. She wasn't wrong. I grew up in a one-story house in Dayton, with a father who fixed cars and a mother who worked nights at a grocery store. Money was a stranger back then. Every dollar mattered. I swore I'd never go back to that kind of life. Maybe that's why I worked like a man possessed, 80-hour weeks. No vacations I didn't answer emails through. On Sundays, I grilled steaks by the lake, while Alan kicked a football and Emily snapped photos of ducks. Mary's laughter carried across the water. Back then I thought we were untouchable, one of those families people envied from the outside. Now, when I close my eyes, I can still smell that grill, still hear the quiet hum of peace before the storm, and every time I remember, I wonder, how long was Doug watching me, waiting for the right moment to break it all apart? Looking back, the cracks were there long before I noticed. It started small. A missing invoice here, a duplicate transaction there. I'd asked the accounting department about it, and they'd shrug, saying it must have been an upload glitch. I brushed it off at first. The company was expanding fast. New contracts pouring in, new systems being integrated. Mistakes happened. Then one evening I stayed late to finish quarterly reports. The office was empty, except for the hum of computers and the buzz of the vending machine light. As I reviewed the accounts, I found 3 wire transfers totaling $50,000, sent to an equipment supplier I didn't recognize. The routing number traced to an offshore account. When I confronted Doug the next morning, he gave me that charming grin that used to make investors trust him instantly. "George, relax," he said, patting my shoulder. "We're diversifying operations overseas. It's all above board." His tone was so casual that I felt embarrassed for questioning him, but that night Mary noticed I was distant during dinner. "Another work thing?" she asked. I nodded, trying not to show the unease building in my chest. She said, "You're carrying the company on your back, George. Don't let it eat you alive." 2 weeks later, Patricia Monroe from HR called me into her office. "Doug says you've been accessing restricted financial files," she said, flipping through a folder. Her expression was cool, rehearsed. "It's not protocol." I told her I was investigating irregularities, but she cut me off with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Then let Doug handle it. He's the CEO." I walked out of that meeting with my stomach in knots. For the first time in my career, I felt like a man standing on thin ice. And the water beneath was darker than I could see. The last normal night of my old life was a Friday. Mary had made her famous lasagna. The kids were laughing over some inside joke, and the house glowed with warmth. I remember thinking, this is it. I've done it. This is the life I promised my family. After dinner, I poured a glass of bourbon and stepped onto the back deck. The lake was still, the moonlight rippling across the surface like silk. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. My phone buzzed. A text from Doug. "We need to talk Monday, urgent." I didn't think much of it then. Doug was always urgent. That weekend, Emily had her school photography exhibit. She'd captured a photo of me at the office window, my reflection blurred against the city lights. She called it Dad in numbers. I laughed when I saw it, but something about it unsettled me. It looked like a man half there, fading behind the glass. On Sunday night, Mary kissed me goodnight and said, "Promise me you'll slow down this year." I told her I would. I even meant it. The next morning, when I walked into Midland's lobby, people avoided my eyes. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. I thought maybe I'd spilled coffee on my tie. Then Patricia appeared with 2 security guards and said softly, "Doug wants to see you." Her tone told me everything before the words came. And by the end of that meeting, my world, my career, my family's name, everything I'd built from dust, was about to be ripped apart. Doug's office always smelled like power, leather, coffee, and the faint tang of cigar smoke he wasn't supposed to have indoors. That morning it smelled the same, but the air was different, heavy, watching. I stepped inside and saw Patricia Monroe already seated, a stack of folders in front of her. Doug didn't look up from his desk. He just said, "Sit down, George." He pushed one of the folders toward me. Inside were printouts of financial transactions, signed under my name, transfers to fake vendors, invoices approved by my credentials, even authorization emails that looked exactly like mine. For a few seconds, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. "This isn't me," I said. My voice cracked on the word "isn't." Doug sighed, rubbing his temples like a disappointed father. "George, I tried to believe you were loyal," he said. "But these numbers don't lie." I looked at Patricia. Her face was blank, her pen tapping against the folder like a metronome counting down the end of my life. "You know this isn't real," I told her. She didn't answer. Doug leaned back. "We can handle this quietly," he said. "If you resign, we won't press charges. We'll tell the board it was a misunderstanding." His tone was calm, reasonable, the way a man speaks when he knows he's already won. But something inside me refused to kneel. "You're setting me up," I said. "I found those missing funds. I know what you're doing." That was when his expression changed, the calm slipping into cold calculation. He stood slowly and said, "Careful, George. Accusations like that can ruin a man." He dismissed me with a wave, and Patricia escorted me out as if I were a stranger. The whole office stared. Ethan looked at me, confused and frightened. I tried to speak, but my throat wouldn't work. That night when I got home, Mary saw the look on my face and whispered, "What happened?" I didn't have the words yet. I only knew that I'd just shaken hands with the devil, and he'd smiled while taking everything from me. 2 days later, an email appeared in my inbox from Doug's personal assistant, Linda Avery. It said simply, "Check your desk drawer before you leave today." My pulse quickened. By then, rumors were spreading through the office like wildfire. People whispered when I passed. Someone had leaked that I was under investigation. That evening, when everyone was gone, I opened the drawer. There, tucked neatly beneath my calculator, was a plain white envelope. Inside were $10,000 in $100 bills. The sight of it made my stomach twist. It was bait. Obvious, crude, but effective. Before I could react, the office door opened. Patricia stood there with a security guard, holding her phone like she'd just finished a call. "We received a tip," she said. Her tone was surgical, emotionless, about company funds. The guard came forward and lifted the envelope from my hand like evidence in a crime scene. I remember trying to explain, but my voice came out frantic, guilty by its own desperation. The next morning, Doug called an emergency board meeting. I wasn't invited, but word spread quickly. They'd voted to terminate my employment, effective immediately. The official statement said I had been found in possession of misappropriated company assets. When I tried to log into my computer at home, my credentials had already been revoked. My company car was gone, my email erased. Mary sat across from me at the kitchen table, pale and shaking. "What's happening?" she asked. "Tell me the truth, George." "I didn't do this," I said, louder than I meant to. "Doug's framing me. I found something I wasn't supposed to find." She didn't respond right away. The silence between us stretched until it felt like a wall. "Then you need to prove it," she finally whispered, and that was the first time I realized that no one was going to save me. I would have to save myself. The day before the police came, the sky over Columbus was gray and swollen with rain. I remember sitting in my study, surrounded by files and receipts, trying to piece together the pattern. I'd traced nearly $250,000 through a chain of offshore accounts linked to fake suppliers. The paper trail always led back to Doug, but none of it would matter once he turned the narrative against me. Around 8 p.m. I received another email, this time from an anonymous account. The message said, "Stop digging or they'll destroy you." I stared at the words for a long time, the glow of the screen reflecting in the window. For a moment I could see my own reflection, a tired man in a suit, fighting ghosts that had already surrounded him. Mary came into the room, wearing her robe, her face soft with worry. "You're scaring me," she said. "You've been on edge for weeks. What's going on at work?" I told her I was close to finding something big, something that could change everything. She reached for my hand. "Then be careful, George. People don't like when their secrets come out." That night the storm broke. Rain hammered the windows, lightning flashing across the lake. I lay awake beside Mary, listening to the thunder. I didn't know it yet, but that would be the last night I'd ever sleep in that bed as a free man, because by morning the doorbell would ring, and when I opened it, 2 officers would be waiting with a warrant, and Doug Reiner's fingerprints all over my downfall. They say the courtroom is where truth lives, but I learned fast that it's where truth goes to die. Dressed in a suit and rehearsed like a stage play. The first day of my trial, the courthouse steps were swarmed with cameras. Reporters called my name like I was a celebrity. "Mr. Whitman!" Any comment on the $200,000 theft? I kept walking, eyes down, wrists trembling against the cold metal of the cuffs. Inside, the air smelled of polish and nerves. Mary sat behind me, stone-faced, her hands clutched around Emily's. Alan wasn't there. She'd kept him home too young for this circus. My lawyer, Martin Kessler, looked like a man drowning in paperwork. "We'll do our best," he whispered. His suit was wrinkled, his eyes tired. I knew then I was alone. The prosecution opened with a speech that could have won awards. "Ladies and gentlemen," said District Attorney Elaine Rogers, "this man, trusted, respected, and compensated, stole from the very company that fed his family." Her voice dripped with righteous fury. She waved charts, receipts, doctored emails, each one another nail in my coffin. Then came Doug Reiner. He took the stand like a saint among sinners. His tone broke on the word betrayal. "George was more than an employee," he said. "He was a friend. But sometimes greed changes people." The courtroom sighed in sympathy. Elaine patted his hand. I wanted to stand, to scream the truth, but Martin tugged my sleeve. "Don't," he muttered. "You'll look unstable." Patricia Monroe testified next, confirming the missing funds and incriminating behavior. When she said she'd found cash in my desk drawer, I saw the jury lean forward, hungry for a villain. My mouth went dry. When it was our turn, Martin called one witness, Ethan Cole. The kid was terrified. He stuttered, said he'd never seen George do anything wrong, but also couldn't rule anything out. His words fell apart mid-sentence. When court adjourned that day, the whispers followed me all the way to the holding cell. "White-collar thief," someone spat as I passed. "Rich man crying poor." And as the cell door slammed behind me, I understood truth didn't matter. Image did, and mine had been expertly destroyed. The trial dragged for 6 weeks, each day carving another piece off my soul. Martin tried to challenge the evidence, but for every question he asked, Elaine had an answer polished and waiting. The fake spreadsheets, the emails from my account, the falsified signature, all lined up too neatly. Every angle covered, every defense anticipated. Doug's lawyers even brought in a forensic accountant who swore the funds had passed through my personal checking account. I begged Martin to check the routing numbers. They weren't even mine. "It's circumstantial," he said weakly, "but juries eat this up." Meanwhile, my life outside the courtroom disintegrated. The house was repossessed within a month. Midland froze my retirement fund. Mary had to sell her car just to pay for groceries. Neighbors stopped waving. The church that once asked me to sponsor fundraisers now pretended not to know me. Emily refused to go to school. Kids taunted her, called her the thief's daughter. Mary tried to keep strong, but I could see her slipping away every time she visited. Her voice grew quieter, her hugs shorter. One afternoon she said, "If you did this, George, just tell me. I can forgive you." I stared at her through the glass divider, my palms pressed to the cold surface. "I didn't, Mary, I swear to God." She nodded, but her eyes told a different story. Not belief, but exhaustion. By the time the jury went to deliberate, I already knew the outcome. There was no suspense, no hope. Doug had crafted the perfect lie, and I had walked straight into it. When the verdict came back guilty on all counts, I didn't even flinch. I just stared at the floor tiles and listened to the sound of my own life being buried under applause for a crime I hadn't committed. Judge Robert Cleary looked at me like he was speaking to a headline, not a man. "George Whitman," he said, "you were entrusted with responsibility and privilege. You abused both. This court sentences you to 22 years in the Ohio State Penitentiary." 22 years. The words didn't hit me at first. They floated heavy and distant like thunder before the rain. I remember glancing at Mary. She didn't cry. She just stood, turned, and led Emily out by the hand. The door closed behind them, and I never saw them again for almost 2 decades. As the bailiff tightened the cuffs around my wrists, Doug caught my eye from across the room. He gave a small nod, not of victory but acknowledgement. A silent confession no one else saw. That moment branded itself into my memory. The walk from the courtroom to the transport van felt endless. My shoes echoed down the hall, each step further from the world I knew. Reporters shouted questions I couldn't answer. Flashbulbs exploded like gunfire. In the van, I stared out the barred window at the courthouse steps, where I'd once stood giving interviews about corporate integrity. The irony was a knife twisting in my chest. When we reached the prison intake center, the smell of sweat and disinfectant hit me. They stripped me of my clothes, my watch, my dignity. Taggart handed me an orange jumpsuit and said, "Welcome to the real world, Whitman." That night, as I lay on a thin mattress under flickering lights, the verdict finally landed. 22 years, 2 decades for something I didn't do. And for the first time in my life, I cried. Not for the years I'd lose, but for the man I'd once been, who still believed justice was real. They say a man's first night inside decides who he'll become. By the time I stepped off the transport bus at Madison Correctional, my wrists were raw from the cuffs, my throat dry from hours of silence. The air smelled like metal, bleach, and something sour that never washed away. The guards barked orders, "Eyes forward! Hands behind your back!" And we obeyed like cattle heading into some mechanical purgatory. We passed through steel gates that clanged shut behind us, with a sound that felt permanent. Inside, everything was noise. The buzz of fluorescent lights, the hum of fans, the clang of bars. I remember thinking, this isn't punishment. It's erasure. They took everything, my clothes, my ring, my wedding photo, my name. From that moment, I was inmate 74013. They gave me an orange uniform and boots that didn't fit. My hands shook as I held the folded clothes, but I refused to let them see it. I wouldn't give them that. The intake guard, a broad man with a scar under his eye, grinned. "Welcome to Madison, Whitman. Heard you're the fancy one, the money guy." His tone was mocking, but beneath it I caught curiosity. "You'll fit right in." He led me down a corridor lined with faces, tattooed, hollow, watching. Every man behind those bars looked like a warning. Someone spat on the floor as I passed. Someone else muttered, "Rich boy." My cell was a 6x8 box that smelled like sweat and despair. A stained mattress, a metal toilet, a sink that dripped. The door slammed shut and the sound echoed through me. I sat on the edge of the bunk trying to steady my breathing. Somewhere down the hall, a man was screaming, a raw, endless sound that didn't stop. That's when it hit me. No lawyer, no money, no truth could reach me here. The walls swallowed everything. And the man I used to be, the man in the lakefront house, the father, the husband, the CFO, died in that moment quietly, without a witness. The lights never went out completely. They dimmed to a dirty yellow that turned every shadow into a threat. I tried to sleep, but the sounds kept coming. The clank of metal bunks, the shuffle of feet, the low murmurs that turned to laughter. Prison had its own language, and I didn't know a single word of it. Sometime after midnight, I heard keys jangling, then voices outside my cell. The door slid open, and 2 inmates stepped inside. One was tall, with a snake tattoo winding up his neck. The other short and wide, his eyes dead and cold. "Hey, money man," the tall one said. "We heard you used to swim in cash. Maybe you can share a little." I stayed seated. "I don't have anything," I said. My voice sounded smaller than I wanted it to. The short one laughed. "Oh, you got something." Everybody's got something. They moved closer. I could smell their breath. Cigarettes, sweat, decay. One grabbed my collar and instinct took over. I shoved back hard. For a second, the tall one stumbled, surprised. Then his fist connected with my stomach. Pain exploded through me. A guard's shout cut through the chaos. The men froze. "Back off!" Metal slammed against metal and the door locked again. I curled on the bunk, gasping, my ribs screaming. Later, as I lay awake staring at the cracked ceiling, I realized how naive I'd been. I'd thought the worst had already happened. The arrest, the trial, the sentence. But this was the real punishment. Not the years. Not the walls. The humiliation of being nothing. Somewhere in the distance, the same man screamed again, a sound that belonged to all of us. I pressed my hand against my ribs and whispered to no one, "I will survive this." It wasn't a promise. It was defiance. By dawn, I looked like a man I didn't recognize. Swollen lip, bruised ribs, dirt on my hands. The morning bell rang, echoing through the corridors. The cell doors clanged open one by one, releasing the tide of orange uniforms into the grey light of the yard. Breakfast was served in metal trays, watery eggs, burnt toast, coffee that tasted like rust. I sat alone at a corner table, eyes down. The noise around me was a storm of shouts and laughter and scraping metal. That's when a man slid onto the bench across from me. Tall, black, with calm eyes that saw everything. He wore his uniform loose, his posture relaxed. "You're the new one," he said. "The money guy." I nodded cautiously. "They call me Ty," he said. "Tyrone Barker. Been here 12 years. Don't talk much unless it matters." I didn't answer. He smiled faintly. "You want to make it here, you keep 2 rules. Don't owe nobody and don't believe nobody." He stood, took his tray and walked off. Just like that. No threats, no tricks. Just truth, the kind you only learn after years inside. That morning I stepped into the prison yard for the first time. The sky above was pale and colorless, the chain-link fence stretching toward the horizon like a cage over the sun. I took a breath. The air was sharp, cold, real, and somewhere deep inside me, under the fear and shame, a small spark lit again, the stubborn belief that I'd find a way to prove the truth. But for now, I was just another number, and the world outside had already forgotten my name. The first year crawled. The second blurred. By the 5th, days stopped being days at all. Prison had a way of stealing the edges of time, of sanding it down until everything felt the same. Morning, noon, night, all just shades of gray under the same flickering lights. I built a routine to stay alive. Wake up before dawn, 50 push-ups beside the bunk, wash my face in freezing water that smelled faintly of iron. Breakfast, yard time, work detail in the laundry. Back to the cell, repeat. There was safety in repetition, a rhythm that dulled the ache of remembering who I used to be. They eventually transferred me to a medium security wing, less violent but colder in spirit. Men there didn't fight with fists. They fought with silence, with stares, with secrets traded like currency. Ty Barker was there too, working in the library. "Books keep you sane," he said once, sliding me a worn copy of The Count of Monte Cristo. When I finished it, I sat awake all night, trembling at the irony. A man framed, forgotten, and dreaming of revenge. Letters came less and less from home. At first, Mary wrote every week, then every month, then only on birthdays. Emily's handwriting changed, her words shorter, distant. Alan stopped writing altogether. One day, the chaplain, Reverend Paul Steiner, stopped by my cell. "You still carry the world on your back," he said gently. "Maybe you should put it down for a while." I told him, "If I put it down, I'll disappear." He smiled, sad but kind. "Maybe disappearing is how you survive here." That night I lay awake, listening to the hum of the vents, trying to remember the sound of my children laughing. But all I heard was the echo of a life I no longer recognized. Prison didn't just cage me, it reshaped me. My hair turned gray before I hit 50. My hands, once steady from years of balancing books, trembled when I wrote. I started teaching GED math classes to inmates. At first it was a way to pass the time. Then it became something else. A way to prove I still had value, even behind bars. The men respected me. "Whitman's the professor," they'd say. I'd draw equations on a chalkboard so old it shed more dust than chalk. Ty sat in the back, nodding quietly, his eyes always half smiling. "So you teaching them numbers," he said once, "but you teaching yourself patience." Some days guards asked for help too. taxes, letters, simple math for their kids. I never said no. Every small act of usefulness was a lifeline. Still, there were moments when the walls closed in. Once in the yard, I caught sight of a cloud formation that looked like our old lake house. My knees almost buckled. It wasn't the violence that broke me, and it was memory. Memory was the cruelest cell of all. When I turned 55, Ty smuggled a cupcake from the kitchen and stuck a paperclip in it as a candle. "Another year, old man," he said, still breathing. Still standing, I laughed. It was the first real laugh I'd managed in years. Later that night, as lights out echoed through the block, I whispered into the dark, "Still standing." I needed to hear it, because part of me no longer believed it was true. By year 15, I had stopped counting the days. The outside world became a myth. When new inmates arrived, they spoke of phones without buttons, cars that drove themselves, stores where you didn't even check out. The world had moved on, sleek, wireless, merciless. I was a fossil with a number. One morning, a guard named Daniels, a kid barely old enough to shave, tossed a stack of mail through the bars. "Fan mail, Whitman," he joked. Most were state notices or junk, but one envelope caught my eye. It was from Mary. The first in almost 3 years. Her handwriting trembled. "George, I thought I should tell you I'm selling the house. It's too big, too empty. Emily's married now. Alan lives in Denver. I hope you find peace. Mary." I read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in the small metal box that held all I had left. Thayer comb, a Bible, a photograph of my children when they still smiled at me. That night, Ty sat beside me in the yard. "You okay, old man?" he asked. I handed him the letter. He read it in silence, then nodded. She moved on. "Don't hate her for it." "I don't," I said quietly. "I just wish I could have watched them live." He looked at me for a long time, then said something I'll never forget. "You still can. But first you gotta get out of here." I laughed, bitter. "So you think I got 22 years to wait out?" Ty smiled. "Nah, I think truth's got a funny way of showing up when people least expect it. At the time, I thought he was just comforting me, but 2 years later, a letter arrived that would prove him right. By the time I hit my 17th year inside, Ty Barker was the only constant I had left. Men came and went, faces changed, rules shifted, but Ty stayed. He had a way of carrying calm through chaos, like he'd made peace with every demon in this place. He wasn't a saint, though. Everyone knew Ty had once been deep into money laundering. A white-collar criminal with a street soul, as he liked to say. One night, we sat in the prison yard, backs against the concrete wall, watching lightning flicker on the horizon. Ty lit a cigarette and handed it to me. I hadn't smoked in years, but I took it anyway. It tasted like fire and memory. "You ever think about how it all started?" he asked. "Every damn day," I said. He exhaled slowly. "You ever hear of Midland Components before you got locked up?" I turned to him, confused. "That's the company I worked for." "Yeah," he said, squinting. "I ran a side hustle for a guy once. Handled offshore accounts for a few corporations in Ohio. Midland was one of them. Name I'll never forget, Douglas Reiner. That man moved money like smoke. Never left fingerprints." My pulse quickened. "You're telling me Doug was laundering money?" Ty nodded. "Through shell companies in the Caymans and Belize. But get this. Around 98, one of his accountants got too nosy, started asking questions. Next thing I know, the guy's name disappears from everything." "You telling me that was you?" I stared at the sky, the thunder rolling in the distance. "Yeah," I whispered. "That was me." Ty laughed, low and bitter. "Then you weren't just framed, brother. You were buried alive." That night I couldn't sleep. The old rage came back, but now it had direction. For the first time in years, I had a thread, and small, fragile, but real, and deep down, I knew if I ever got out of this place, I was going to pull on that thread until Doug Reiner's whole empire came apart. Over the next few months, Ty and I met during work detail, in the laundry room where the machines drowned out conversation. He told me names, bank codes, patterns, fragments of things he remembered from his laundering days. I scribbled everything in tiny, coded notes on scraps of soapbox cardboard. We pieced together the puzzle slowly. Doug had set up at least 4 offshore companies under fake directors. The transfers matched the same time period as the ones he pinned on me. Every detail Ty gave fit perfectly with what I'd seen in the books all those years ago. One day I said, "If we can prove this, maybe—" Ty cut me off. "Proof don't mean nothing in here, George. You need someone out there willing to believe it. He was right. And I didn't have anyone left. Mary had moved on. My kids barely remembered the sound of my voice. Who was I going to call? The same justice system that caged me. Weeks passed. Then one afternoon, Ty came to me in the yard, his face serious. Got a friend who owes me a favor, he said. He's getting out next month. Ex-coder, smart guy. He can send a letter for you. You just tell him where. It felt impossible that something as small as a letter could matter after 20 years. But I wrote it anyway. It was the first time I'd touched a pen for myself, not for math lessons or forms. I wrote everything I knew, the accounts, the names, the dates, even Ty's story about the Caymans. When Ty's contact left the prison, he took that letter tucked inside a hollowed-out Bible, and just like that, for the first time in 2 decades, my words left the walls. Hope is a dangerous thing in prison. It keeps you breathing, but it also keeps you bleeding. Every day after that letter left, I waited for something, a reply, a visit, a sign. Weeks turned to months. Nothing came. Then, one winter morning, I was called to the warden's office. Warden Nolan was a quiet man and fair but tired. "You've got mail," he said, sliding an envelope across the desk. Federal postmark, FBI. My heart hammered so hard I could barely breathe. The letter was from Special, Agent Ruth Daniels. She wrote that she had received information related to my conviction that new documents tied Douglas Reiner to offshore embezzlement schemes dating back to 1997. She said she was reopening an investigation. Reopening. My hands shook as I read it again and again. Ty grinned when I told him. "Told you, old man. Truth don't stay buried forever." That night the noise of the cell block faded. I lay on my bunk staring at the ceiling, clutching the letter against my chest. For the first time since I'd heard the click of those cuffs all those years ago, I allowed myself to imagine walking out. Not in chains. Not in shame, but free. But with every flicker of hope came fear. Because men like Doug didn't build their kingdoms alone, and if the FBI was coming after him, I knew he'd come for me first. Even from the outside, the war had started. Only this time I wasn't the victim. I was the witness. It came on an ordinary afternoon as grey sky, slow rain against the windows, the kind of day when nothing ever happens. I was sorting towels in the laundry room when Officer Daniels called out my name. "Whitman!" Mail call. He handed me a small cream-colored envelope. My first thought was that it was from Agent Ruth Daniels again. But when I saw the handwriting, shaky, delicate, my hands froze. It was from Linda Avery. I hadn't heard that name in 20 years. Back then, Linda had been Doug's executive assistant. Quiet, loyal, always typing in the background while Doug made deals. I remembered her nervous smile, the way her fingers tapped too fast when she lied for him in court. I tore the envelope open with trembling fingers. Inside was a single page, handwritten in blue ink. "George, I don't know if this letter will reach you. I've lived with the guilt for too long. Doug Reiner ordered me to plant the envelope in your desk. He said it was for insurance. I never knew he'd take it this far. He forged everything, the emails, the transfers, the invoices. He paid people to testify. He said he'd ruin me if I ever spoke. I'm dying now, George. I need you to know the truth. I'm sorry." The letter shook in my hands. I read it again and again, each line slicing through 22 years of silence. Around me the machines hummed on, oblivious. Ty came over, saw my face, and asked softly, "What is it?" I handed him the letter. He read it slow, his lips moving. When he finished, he looked at me like I'd just been resurrected. "This is it, old man," he said. "This is your key." That night, for the first time in decades, I felt something I'd forgotten the weight of. Hope. Real, burning, reckless hope. But I also knew that kind of hope could get a man killed. The next morning, I requested a meeting with Warden Nolan. He raised an eyebrow when I slid Linda's letter across his desk. "You're saying this proves your innocence?" "It's the first brick," I said. "And the FBI already reopened an investigation." He read it carefully, tapping his pen against the paper. "Handwritten confession, no verification, author deceased. That's thin ice, Whitman." "But," he sighed, "I've seen men get out with less." He made a copy and said he'd forward it to Agent Daniels. As I left his office, I felt the weight shift. For years I'd been silent, compliant, invisible. Now every guard, every inmate who looked at me saw something different. a man who might actually have a way out. That night, Ty warned me, "You best keep that hope quiet. Some folks in here got friends out there, friends who don't like loose ends." He was right. 2 days later, a note appeared under my cell door. It was written on a torn napkin. "Stop digging or you'll never see daylight again." I didn't show it to the guards. Instead, I burned it in the toilet bowl, the flame flickering blue against the steel. I wasn't stopping. Not now. A week later, Agent Ruth Daniels herself came to visit. She was mid-40s, sharp eyes, no nonsense. She looked at me through the glass and said, "Mr. Whitman, we believe your former employer is connected to a network of offshore fraud cases. Your conviction might have been part of a cover-up." I could barely breathe. "So, you believe me?" "I believe the numbers," she said. "And they don't lie." When she left, I pressed my palm to the glass where her hand had rested. The war had officially left the walls. Over the next year, I became a ghost in 2 worlds, one behind bars, one outside where the truth was finally unraveling. The FBI subpoenaed old company files. They found encrypted backups hidden on servers Doug thought he'd erased years ago. The trail led straight to offshore accounts, dummy corporations, and millions siphoned into shell businesses. Every time the guards called me to the warden's office, my heart raced. Updates came in fragments, coded messages from Agent Daniels' reports. Evidence recovered, witness interviews underway. Federal charges likely. Doug Reiner, the man who'd smiled as my life burned, was finally under investigation. Ty would sit across from me at night, grinning. "I told you, old man. Truth walks slow, but it walks strong. But victory in prison is never clean." Word spread fast. I started feeling eyes on me in the yard. Cold, calculating. One afternoon, I found a razor blade under my pillow. A warning. Doug still had reach. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak in the pipes sounded like a threat. But beneath the fear, a strange calm lived. Because for the first time in 22 years, I wasn't just surviving. I was fighting. A month later, Warden Nolan called me in again. "Whitman," he said, sliding a document across the desk. "The Bureau just filed a motion to review your case. They're calling it newly discovered evidence." I stared at the words until they blurred. After 2 decades, my name was finally being spoken in a courtroom again, not as a criminal, but as a man who might have been telling the truth all along. When I returned to my cell, Ty was waiting, arms crossed, smiling. "Told you that letter was your key." And for the first time in years, I smiled back. It was a strange thing, hearing about justice secondhand while still wearing an orange jumpsuit. Agent Ruth Daniels visited me again 6 months after Linda's letter changed everything. This time she didn't look cautious. She looked determined. She slid a folder across the metal table between us. Inside were photographs, stacks of documents, offshore wire transfers, and Doug Reiner's signature in all the right places. "He's been moving money for decades," she said. "Your conviction was part of a cover-up. We're issuing federal warrants." I felt lightheaded. "You have enough to charge him?" Her eyes flicked up to mine. "We already did." For a moment I couldn't speak. I imagined Doug, the man who'd called me a friend, who'd looked me in the eye as they cuffed me, opening his front door to find a wall of agents waiting. I wanted to feel triumph, but what I felt instead was something colder, hollow. "Does this mean I'm free?" I asked. Ruth's expression softened. "Not yet. These things take time, but you've been officially declared under review. The state court will reconsider your case once our findings are complete." She stood, gathering her notes. "You did good, Mr. Whitman. Most people would have given up." When she left, I sat staring at the spot where her hands had rested. The hum of the visitation room faded. I thought about Mary, about Emily and Alan, about the years that had been stolen, one sunrise at a time. Justice was finally moving, but it was slow, dragging its feet through the mud of bureaucracy. Still, somewhere out there, Doug Reiner was in handcuffs, and that image, that single perfect image, kept me breathing through the nights that followed. The news reached the prison a week later. "Former Midland CEO arrested in federal fraud scandal," the headline read. Someone had smuggled in a newspaper, and the yard was buzzing with talk. For once, my name wasn't the punchline. It was proof. Ty slapped the paper down in front of me during lunch. "There he is, your boy Doug. Bet he don't look so clean now." There was a photo, Doug in handcuffs, jaw clenched, escorted by 2 FBI agents. The article said he faced multiple charges of fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy. Millions laundered through shell corporations. Linda Avery's deathbed letter had been verified through forensic ink analysis. Her confession was now federal evidence. I ran my finger over Doug's photo. His hair was thinner, his face older, but those eyes, smug and cold, and were the same. When the guards called for yard time, men I barely knew nodded at me, murmuring, "Heard they got your boss." One said quietly, "Guess the rich ain't untouchable after all." That night, Warden Nolan stopped by my cell. "Whitman," he said, "you might want to keep your head down for a while. The state's reviewing your conviction. The press is calling it a miscarriage of justice." Miscarriage, I said bitterly. "It's been 22 years. He gave me a long look. "Sometimes justice just needs to remember you exist." When he left, I sat on the bunk in the dark. Doug was in custody, but it didn't feel like victory. My life was still trapped behind these walls. The nights, the screams, the loss, none of it could be undone, but still, for the first time since 1998, I allowed myself to whisper the words, "I'm going home." The months that followed were a blur of hearings, paperwork, and cautious optimism. Agent Daniels visited twice more, updating me as the federal case unraveled. Doug had taken a plea deal to avoid a life sentence, naming others in the process. "He's given us everything," she said, "but your release depends on the state judge." So I waited. Days became weeks. Weeks became a slow bleed of time. Every morning I'd wake before dawn, pack and repack the small box of things I owned. The photograph of my kids, the Bible, Linda's letter, just in case today was the day they called my name. Ty would watch, shaking his head with a grin. "You're like a kid waiting on Christmas." "Christmas," I said, "doesn't usually take 22 years to show up." One morning during count, a guard approached with a sealed envelope. "From the State Board," he said. My hands shook as I opened it. The words blurred at first, but I forced myself to read aloud. "Conviction vacated. Immediate release ordered pending administrative processing." For a moment I couldn't move, couldn't speak. Then Ty grinned wide and full. "You did it, old man. You're walking out." The noise of the prison faded. I felt the weight of every year, every breath, every second pressing down on me. I had dreamt of this moment for so long that I almost didn't believe it was real. But the papers were signed. The cell door would open, and the man they called 74013 was finally going to step back into the world as George Whitman. They say freedom has a sound, that metallic buzz before the gate slides open, the rush of wind that doesn't smell like disinfectant. For 22 years I imagined that moment 1,000 ways. I thought I'd fall to my knees, shout, maybe cry, but when it finally came I just stood there, frozen, as the guards handed me a brown paper bag with my life inside. A comb, a Bible, Linda's letter, one faded photo of Emily and Alan. The release officer read my name flatly. "George Whitman." "You're cleared. Don't come back." I stepped forward. The morning light hit my face like something holy and cruel all at once. I blinked hard. The sky looked bigger than I remembered, too blue, almost violent in its brightness. Ty was standing behind the fence, grinning through the bars. "Go live, old man," he yelled. "Don't waste it." I raised a hand, but my throat was too tight to speak. Then the gate clanged shut behind me, and the sound echoed through the emptiness like a punctuation mark at the end of a nightmare. Agent Ruth Daniels waited by a government sedan, paperwork in hand. "It's over," she said softly. "Reiner's in federal custody. He won't see daylight again." I nodded, staring at the world beyond the parking lot. Cars, trees, movement. After decades of sameness, it felt overwhelming. "What happens now?" I asked. She hesitated. "You start over." 2 words, so simple, so impossible. As we drove away from the prison, I looked out the window, watching the walls shrink in the distance. For years I'd dreamed of seeing them disappear, but instead of joy, all I felt was fear. The question I hadn't dared to ask: who was I now that I wasn't a prisoner anymore? The halfway house was small, grey, quiet. They gave me a room the size of a closet, a schedule to follow, and a phone I didn't know how to use. The world outside had moved on. Sleek cars, touchscreen everything, people staring at screens instead of faces. I might as well have stepped onto another planet. On my 3rd day out, I called Mary. My voice trembled as I said her name. There was a long pause before she answered. "George." Just hearing it from her lips nearly broke me. It's really me, I said. I'm out. I know, she said softly. I saw it on the news. Her voice was polite, careful, distant. Not the voice of a wife, but of a stranger. I asked about Emily and Alan. She told me they were doing well, was grown, busy, living their own lives. Maybe give them some time, she said gently. It's been a long road. 22 years, an entire life. I walked to the lake the next morning, the same one I used to live beside, though the houses were different now, larger, colder. I watched the sunlight shimmer across the water, the same way it had when Emily was little, running in the grass with her camera. I didn't cry. I thought I would, but I didn't. I just stood there watching my breath turn to mist and whispered, I'm here. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like survival. That first night I couldn't sleep. The silence was too deep, too kind. No buzz of lights, no shouting, no clanging doors. Just quiet, and the soft ticking of an old clock in the hallway. I lay on the thin mattress staring at the ceiling, counting breaths like I used to count days. At some point, I sat up and opened the Bible Ty had given me. Inside, tucked between the pages, was a folded scrap of paper, a note I'd never seen before. When you walk out, remember, freedom ain't revenge. It's peace. Don't waste it trying to balance the scales. Ty's handwriting. Simple, sharp. He must have slipped it in before I left. I read it over and over. Revenge had been my fuel for years. But now that Doug was behind bars and I was free, I realized vengeance didn't fill the empty spaces. It didn't bring back my youth, my family, or the man I used to be. The next morning I walked into town. The air smelled of rain and gasoline. People brushed past me, unaware of the ghost walking among them. I stopped at a diner and ordered black coffee. The first real coffee I'd had in 2 decades. The taste hit me like a memory I didn't know I still had. A waitress named Claire asked where I was headed. I smiled faintly and said, anywhere but back. She laughed. That's a good start. And for the first time since I'd heard the word guilty, I let myself laugh too. It sounded strange. Rusty but real. 2 weeks after my release, I stood in front of the house that used to be mine. The lake shimmered the same way it always had, but the shutters were painted blue now, and a new family's laughter drifted through the open windows. A tricycle sat in the driveway where my Mercedes once gleamed. For a moment I couldn't breathe. I stood there on the sidewalk, my old key still in my pocket, useless, heavy, rusted from time. I thought about knocking, about telling the new owners, I built this place. I laid every tile, painted those walls. But what would I say after that? And then I lost it all because someone lied? Instead, I just watched from the edge of the property, like a ghost haunting his own life. The man mowing the lawn waved politely, thinking I was a passerby admiring the view. I nodded back, smiling thinly. Across the lake, I saw the reflection of the trees swaying in the water. The same view where I'd once watched my daughter take her first photograph, where I'd grilled steaks with Mary while the sun went down. It was all still there, untouched by time except for the people who used to fill it. I stayed until the sun sank behind the trees and the porch light flickered on. Then I dropped the old key into the grass. It made no sound when it landed. That was the moment I understood. I hadn't come back to reclaim anything. I'd come back to say goodbye. It took me another month to gather the courage to find Emily. I called first. The number Mary gave me went to voicemail, her voice cheerful but distant. Hi, you've reached Emily Whitman. Leave a message. I hung up twice before I finally spoke. It's your dad, I said. I'm out. I'd like to see you. 3 days later, she met me at a coffee shop downtown. When she walked in, I almost didn't recognize her. She was 39 now, older, composed, her hair tied back, a camera bag slung across her shoulder just like when she was 17. Hi, Dad, she said, sitting across from me. Her smile was small, uncertain. I wanted to say 1,000 things, to apologize, to explain, to beg for time back. But all I managed was, you look just like your mother. She nodded, eyes glistening. She told me everything. About the letter, the case. All of it silence stretched between us. The sound of coffee machines and laughter from nearby tables felt like another universe. I used to think you were guilty, she said finally, her voice trembling. I was so angry. I didn't understand how the world could just... She stopped, shaking her head. I'm sorry. I reached across the table and touched her hand gently. You don't need to be sorry, Emily. You were a child. I was supposed to protect you from all this. She smiled through tears. I kept one of your old pictures. From before. She handed me a photo, the one she'd taken of me years ago, the reflection of my face in the office window. Dad in numbers? I laughed softly. I still have it. I always did, she said. When she left, I sat for a long time staring at that picture. I wasn't that man anymore. But for a brief moment holding that photo, I remembered what it felt like to be him. Mary agreed to meet me one evening in the park. She'd aged gracefully, the same soft eyes, though they carried decades of distance now. She wore a grey sweater, simple, elegant. When she saw me, she smiled, the kind you give someone you used to love in another lifetime. You look good. George, she said. So do you, I answered. We sat on a bench watching children play near the swings. For a while neither of us spoke. The wind carried the smell of wet leaves, the hum of cicadas rising with the dusk. I don't know what to say, I finally admitted. Maybe we don't need to say anything, she said gently. Some things don't have words. We talked for a while, about Emily, about Alan, who was living in Colorado with a family of his own. Mary told me she'd remarried a few years back. I nodded, trying to keep the ache out of my face. I'm happy for you, I said. And I meant it. When she stood to leave, she touched my arm. You deserved better, George. But maybe now you can find peace. As she walked away, I felt the years between us like a canyon, wide, permanent, but not bitter. Just empty. That night I returned to my small rented room. The air was cool and quiet. I opened the window, listened to the sound of crickets, and whispered to the darkness, I forgive you. Mary, I forgive them all. But the hardest person to forgive was the one staring back at me in the glass. A year after my release, a local journalist named Jenna Fields reached out. She wanted to do a feature on wrongful convictions. I almost said no. I'd spent too long trying to disappear. But something in her voice, calm, respectful, not hungry for headline, made me agree. We met at a small cafe near downtown Columbus, not far from where I used to work. I wore the same grey jacket I'd been given when I left prison. She set a recorder on the table and said, Tell me what happened in your own words. At first, the words came slow. I told her about Midland Components, about Doug Reiner, about the $200,000 lie that became my life sentence. I told her about Linda Avery's letter, about the trial that wasn't a trial, about waking up every day in a cell that smelled like rust and sweat. She didn't interrupt. She just listened. When I told her about Ty, about the night he said truth walks slow but it walks strong, her eyes filled with tears. What happened to him? She asked. He's still inside, I said quietly. Parole hearing's coming up next year. I'll be there when he walks out. When we finished, she turned off the recorder and said, Do you want people to know your story? I thought for a moment. Not for me. For the ones who are still there. The ones who don't get letters, who don't get second chances. Her article came out 2 weeks later. The headline read, The Man Who Took the Falls and Stood Back Up. It went viral, not in the noisy online way, but in whispers and reposts, shared by people who still believed in redemption. For the first time, my name wasn't tied to shame. It was tied to survival. Still, when I read it, I felt something hollow deep inside. Because no matter how well she told it, no one could understand the silence of those 22 years, and no article could give them back. 2 months later, I went back to Madison Correctional to visit Ty, the same gates, the same clanging doors. But this time I was on the other side of the glass. He walked in wearing the same grin that had carried me through decades. Look at you, old man, he said, sitting down. You clean up good. Guess miracles happen, I said, smiling back. We talked for hours. About freedom, about the world outside, about how coffee didn't taste like rust anymore. When I told him I'd be there for his parole hearing, he just nodded. Don't worry about me. You did your time for both of us. You got out. You're the proof. Before I left, he leaned closer and said, You ever think about what you'll do now? You got a story, man. Use it, I laughed softly. Who'd want to hear it? Everyone, he said. Because it's real. Because it hurts. Because you lived. When I walked out of that building, I looked up at the same razor wire, the same sky I'd stared at for decades. It didn't look cruel anymore. It just looked old. Tired, like it had seen too much. The wind was cold, but it felt clean. And for the first time I realized I wasn't running from the past anymore. I was carrying it, not as a burden, but as proof that I'd survived it. Some nights I still wake up expecting to hear the clang of cell doors. The silence feels wrong, too open, too soft. I keep the lights on sometimes, just to remind myself I can. I've started volunteering with a group that helps the wrongly convicted. I teach them what Ty taught me. Patience, endurance, the stubborn belief that truth doesn't die, even when the world buries it. Sometimes, when I speak, I catch my reflection in the window, older, thinner, quieter, and I barely recognize the man looking back. Doug Reiner died in prison 6 months after his sentencing. A heart attack. The news said it was sudden. When I read it, I felt nothing, no triumph, no closure, just silence. Maybe that's what justice really is. Not satisfaction, but absence. The end of the noise. Mary and I spoke one last time before she moved to Florida. She wished me peace. I wished her happiness. Emily still calls once a week. Alan sometimes. Slowly, the gaps fill, but never completely. Time doesn't heal. It just changes shape. I walk by the lake every evening now. The air smells of pine and water. The world is quiet. And for the first time in years, I can watch the sunset without thinking of bars. I tell my story not for revenge, but for remembrance, for the man who lost half his life and still found the strength to live what was left. Because in the end, truth doesn't set you free. It just stops the bleeding. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.